All right, it's been a couple of weeks since we had our class in Samson. We are in Judges chapter 14. We got about halfway through chapter 14 in studying Samson and this event with his, as he was getting married to a Philistine woman. Before we get started, I do want to mention, I think I mentioned Sunday that we would have an outline for chapter 2 for the Mind Your Faith. And then I had somebody mention, why are you going to do an outline if everybody's supposed to have read it? I said, well, that's true. So I'm not doing an outline, just we're going to cover the questions in the book. We will review it, though. We won't read from the book. We'll review on Sunday what chapter 2 is all about, and then we'll talk about some discussion questions, and I'll add in a couple of extra that Doy didn't have in there. So that's the plan for Sunday. And then the plan for tonight, hopefully, is to finish up Samson, which means next Wednesday night, the plan will be to cover Mordecai and Esther. It's kind of hard to separate Mordecai from Esther and just do one or the other, so we're going to try to do both at the same time as we study through the book of Esther. All right, so Judges chapter 14, we've picked up where Samson, he's offered this riddle to these 30 companions, individuals who were given to him as friends, because he didn't really have any friends to, per the custom of the Philistines, to have with him before he got married or whatever. But he offered up this riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. And of course, we know that Samson killed a lion. He left. He came back later, and in the lion's carcass there was a beehive. Bees had taken residence in there, and there was honey. It is interesting. James mentioned something to me a couple of Sundays ago. He mentioned the idea that it could be that the reason why he didn't mention this, because we talked about the fact he didn't mention this to his parents. He didn't mention this to anybody, as far as we know. And it could be that part of the Nazirite vow was that you weren't to eat or weren't to touch a carcass. And that could be part of the reason why maybe he didn't say anything, because presumably he touched the carcass to get the honey. I don't know how he did that if he didn't. Maybe he did it a different way. But perhaps that's one of the reasons why he didn't say anything to his parents. But we pick up here in verse 14. Now for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. But it came to pass on the seventh day that they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband that he may explain the riddle to us, or else we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so? And of course we know that Samson knew that they had no idea what the answer to that riddle was going to be. Okay, because this happened to Samson, didn't happen to anybody else. And so they coerce, really kind of offer an ultimatum to his Philistine wife. We are going to take you, we will burn you and your father's house with fire if you don't get the information that we need. Because in essence, Samson was tricking them. Okay, remember the deal was, I will give you 30 garments and 30 pieces of clothing or something along that line. But the reverse was true of all of them to give to Samson if they couldn't figure out the riddle. So we see in verse 16, Samson's wife wept on him and said, you only hate me. You do not love me. You have posed a riddle to the sons of my people, but you have not explained it to me. And he said to her, look, I have not explained it to my father or my mother, so should I explain it to you? Now she had wept on him the 7 days while their feast lasted. And it happened on the seventh day that he told her, because she pressed him so much. Then she explained the riddle to the sons of her people. You could ask the question, well, why is it that Samson's wife is willing to do this? Keep in mind, I don't think there was a whole lot of courtship that took place. There wasn't a whole lot of relationship that had built up. And so in a lot of ways, he just kind of picked her. Mom and dad went and got her. And now they're going through this ceremony feast and so forth. And there's not really... I don't think you could say that this woman loved Samson. Okay, certainly not in that amount of time that she have developed that love. But certainly she was worried about her and her father's house. That would certainly have been a concern for her. But she says, you hate me, you don't love me, you posed a riddle, you haven't explained it to me. Of course, she doesn't. It's interesting. I wonder what would have happened if she had told him, they've threatened me, they've threatened my life, the life of my father's house. I wonder what Samson would have done if he would have done anything differently. But she didn't explain that to him as far as we can tell. She just begged on him for 7 days to tell her the answer. And so she does. And then we see in verse 18, so the men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would have not solved my riddle. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave the changes of clothing to those who had explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house. Again, a lot of interesting situations taking place. He insinuates the fact that they had got his wife to just explain what the riddle was. And it says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and then he went down and killed 30. Again, in context to Samson, what have we explained the Spirit of the Lord as being? Because a lot of times we talk about the prophets and the Spirit of the Lord and working miracles and so forth. When it comes to Samson so far, in the couple of times that we've seen this phrase, the Spirit of the Lord coming upon him,
strength that enabled him to do these feats.
Yeah, it seems to have been specifically this, and it was miraculous strength that led him to do these things. And he goes down to Ashkelon. He doesn't kill those 30 men who had coerced his wife to coerce him to tell her the answer, to tell them the answer. You would think that he would kill them. One might even say that they would kind of be their comeuppance for threatening his wife and her family. But instead, he goes to Ashkelon. He kills 30 of their men. He takes their clothes to pay his debt of this riddle that he had kind of gambled or betted with, or whatever you want to say that, to pay this to these 30 men because they did answer the riddle. And it says, so his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house. And then we see in verse 20, so it doesn't say where Samson's wife was during this. Presumably she's still there in her place, apparently in her father's house or whatever. He doesn't take her with him when he goes back to his father's house. And in verse 20, Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. So again, I don't know if this is a cultural thing or if this is a difference of understanding between the Israelites and the Philistines. But for whatever reason, apparently, and we're going to see this later on in chapter 15, the Philistine dad here just assumed that when Samson went back to his father's house, that he didn't want his wife anymore. And so dad gave his daughter to the best man of Samson. And again, I don't think there was any best friendship or anything like that, as would typically accompany a best man scenario. Remember, these companions had to be designated or given to Samson to fulfill these roles. But she ended up being given to his companion. So Samson was angry and he went home. Because we see that in verse 19. His anger was aroused, and he went back to his father's house. So anything through chapter 14?
There's so much wrong with that whole passage.
I know.
To our way of thinking and not for this day.
Yeah.
It's hard to remember all this was done with a very specific purpose.
Right.
That God said, I'm going to use Samson to deliver my people.
Right.
It's all crazy.
Yeah. And notice though that this is, and of course, I mean, to a certain extent, you can understand why Samson was so upset. Okay, but there wasn't a lot of, and again, some of this, we're not given insight into Samson's mind. And so granted, some of this isn't actually written here to tell us that this is what Samson was thinking. But there didn't seem to be a whole lot of love or connection between him and this Philistine woman. She was pretty, and so he chose her to be his wife. And then you also see his anger. Samson's anger tends to kind of flare up from time to time. And this isn't the first time that we've seen this. And of course, in this case, you can kind of understand But, I mean, he refers to his wife as a heifer. I mean, it's just, and again, maybe some of this is lost in cultural background, but it seems so alien to us, so strange that this is the way that he behaved. Especially, maybe even more so because he was an Israelite. Okay, it wasn't like he was a Philistine. A Philistine, okay, well, their ways were obviously strange and odd and maybe even immoral. But Samson, the way he behaved was just different. It was odd. Unlike most of what we read the Israelites being like, certainly. Anything else through chapter 14? Chapter 15, and this kind of goes into a little bit of what happens with his wife and so forth. So after a while, starting in verse 1, in the time of wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. And he said, "Let me go into my wife, into her room." But her father would not permit him to go in. Keep in mind, she'd gone back to her father's house. He went back to his father's house. But what does the scripture say? Is she just this woman? Who is she? His wife. Okay, scripture says it's his wife. So they had gone through whatever ceremony that was binding for the Philistines and for the Israelites, presumably, that understood that this woman's his wife. He has brought a young goat. Doesn't tell us why he brought a young goat. Was it an apology goat? Was it a, hey, I'm here to win back your heart? I don't know. I don't know why he brought a young goat as a gift for some sort. But he brought a young goat. He wants to go see his wife. Dad says no. And in verse 2, "I really thought you thoroughly hated her, therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead." I don't know why the dad is like this. I don't know why he's saying these things. Presumably, he doesn't want to cause any problems since now she belongs to this companion, and taking her back from this Philistine companion, give her to an Israelite may have caused some kind of a social issue or some kind of a problem, maybe even legally with the Philistines. I don't know. But he thought that Samson hated her. And given that Samson knew that she told his secret of his riddle, and then he reacted the way he did, and he went off to his father's house in anger, I can understand thinking that, well, Samson must not want her anymore, I guess. So I can kind of see why he thought that. But it is interesting because presumably the younger sister is unwed. Why don't you take her instead? She's available, and so forth. Nolan?
Is it possible the father may have been pressured by these 30 guys who threatened to kill them, burn them?
That could be.
Anyway?
That could be.
So,
there could have been some kind of a communication or dialogue or understanding there, because this is going to come back to be an issue later. But you're right, there could have been some kind of a pressure taking place from these 30 men from before. Yeah, it could be.
Been a business transaction of sorts too.
It could have been a business,
Conscience and thought, they're taking this guy's money and now he gave his right away.
Yeah, that could be. Of course, the scripture there at the end of Judges 14, we're not told exactly how that process took place, but it could have been a business transaction. And maybe for Philistines, that was a contractual legal thing to do things that way. And maybe that would have caused a problem if he then tried to take this woman back and give her to Samson. That could have been, yeah. But we see in verse 3, Samson said to them, "This time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them." Then Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. Okay, so Samson makes the statement, "This time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I hurt them," which suggests what?
justifying his action.
Okay, so does it suggest that maybe he knew that just randomly going down and picking 30 guys to kill in Ashkelon wasn't justified? Okay, because that's what he did. He went down to Ashkelon. He just picked 30 people to kill, take their clothes, to pay off these 30 companions who had basically tricked his wife into giving them the information or coerced her. Okay, there's some suggestion there that he knew that wasn't It wasn't justified. I won't say it's not right, but that it wasn't a justified thing to do for him just to go down and randomly kill 30 people. But this time, he says, I will be blameless. Again, there's anger here, and you can kind of hear the anger in his words. He's angry that this has happened. And again, I'm hesitant to blame Samson. If he'd been a little bit more in control of his emotions, I mean, I can understand he was justifiably angry about some of these things, but if he'd maybe been a little bit more in control, maybe some of this stuff wouldn't have happened the way it did. But regardless, he says, this time I'm blameless because they won't give me my wife. It's kind of the conclusion here. Verse 4, so he takes these 300 foxes. Where he's putting these things, I don't know. Is there a net big enough for 300 foxes? Is there a room that he's putting them in? But he's catching all of these foxes. No telling how long it took him to catch 300 foxes. I mean, we know he's strong, but we're not told he's miraculously fast. How in the world he caught them, I don't know. But he caught 300 foxes. He took torches. He turned the foxes tail to tail. He put a torch between them, and then he let them go. Verse 5, when he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves. I know, and you have to kind of temper all of this with understanding that God knew this is how Samson was going to react. He knew what was going to happen. And he's using Samson to bring judgment and deliverance for Israel on the Philistines. Okay? But doesn't this feel a little bit like an overreaction? I mean, I don't know just how vast of grain and vineyards we're talking about, but you set 300 foxes loose. Presumably that's 150 pairs. I don't know if they're all tied together. The way I always pictured this was each fox was paired with a torch, and off they go. That's a lot of foxes, and that's a lot of fire. So there's no telling how widespread the destruction was, all because this woman's dad won't give me my wife back. It's just a little overreactive. Again, to our thought process, maybe. Maybe in that culture, in that time, maybe this was a reasonable reaction. Samson seemed to think it was. Because remember what Samson said. He says, this time, if Philistines are harmed, I'm blameless. He's not aiming for the Philistines. He's aiming for their harvest. If any Philistines gets hurt, that's, well, quite frankly, Samson probably would have thought that's kind of the cherry on the top. But the idea here was to hurt their harvest. So in verse 6, the Philistines said, who has done this? And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. Even the Philistines acknowledged what? What did they acknowledge about the relationship of the woman to Samson? That's his father-in-law. Okay, so again, it's interesting because this is what the terms the scriptures use, that Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite. Okay, he's angry because the dad gave the daughter to his best man. But they still seem to recognize that technically speaking, or legally speaking, or however you want to phrase that, those two are married, but the dad did a runaround and gave her to somebody else. And so he's upset about it. So then what did the Philistines do? They burn her and her father with fire. Why not go after Samson? Yeah, Samson's strong for sure. Maybe they didn't want maybe they didn't want to start an international incident over the situation. It seems like the Philistines never cared if they started international incidents with Israel, but maybe they didn't want to bother searching for him. They took it out on the wife and her dad.
It's almost like it was their fault.
It's
If you hadn't done this, we wouldn't be where we are.
It almost sounds as if, and that kind of goes back to what Samson says, that I feel justified in what I'm about to do. Okay, maybe those 30 men that I randomly selected down in Ashkelon, maybe that wasn't justified. This is justified. And the Philistines, instead of taking it out on Samson, they seem to think, yeah, that's a fairly reasonable reaction to this. Again, the culture difference, you read this and you go, man, that just seems like an overreaction. But apparently for the Philistines, this was their way of dealing with it. We're going to punish the ones involved. And so they killed the dad, they killed the daughter. So that ended up happening regardless. And then in verse 7, Samson said to them, since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after that I will cease. So he attacked them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. Then he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Edom. So Samson sees what they do. He says, since you would do a thing like this, then I'm going to take revenge on you. And he kills them. We're not told how many people were involved in doing this. Were these 30 companions, were they part of this group that ended up burning her and everything? I don't know. But Samson, it says there was a great slaughter, and he attacked them hip and thigh. What do you think that means? He attacked them hip and thigh. Okay, ruthlessly. And in fact, there's some commentators that reference, I don't want to be too graphic, it's almost evisceration. Like this was a full, it wasn't just, hey, I'm going to stab you and move on. He slaughtered them, is kind of the connotation here. He didn't hold back, okay? That goes, again, to show not only Samson's anger, which they burned his wife, you know, you can see that, I guess. I don't think this was relationship driven. Like, I don't think he loved her, but you killed my wife, you burned her father, now I'm going to kill you. And so that's what he does. And then he goes down to Edom. But he says, then after that, I will cease. I just think that's interesting. That'll be enough revenge for me. After I kill you, you who have burned my wife and her father, that'll be enough for me and I'll stop. And he does for a period of time. But it's just it's an interesting way of reacting here. It's a very strange account dealing with Samson. Anything else through verse 8? Yes, sir.
I don't know exactly. It would seem like maybe he had some forethought in this when he gets all the foxes and the fires. It seemed like he sticks around as they're waiting. When they come and burn the wife and the father, it seemed like he's right there.
He's right there.
Okay, here we go.
Which begs the question, why didn't he stop him? Maybe he wasn't close enough to stop him in time, but it seems like he was around, or maybe he came upon it a little bit later, but he knew exactly who it was who did it. I don't know. It's really kind of an odd situation, but you're right. It's all right. All right, go into verse 9. Now the Philistines went up, encamped in Judah, and deployed themselves against Lehi. And the men of Judah said, why have you come up against us? And so they answered, we have come up to arrest Samson, to do to him as he has done to us. Now that has gone a step too far for the Philistines, apparently. They weren't chasing him after he killed those 30 men at Ashkelon, presumably. And they weren't all that upset with him, presumably, when he let loose those 300 foxes. But now that he's committed this great slaughter, say committed, he killed these Philistines who were guilty of killing his wife and her dad. Again, it must have been more than just a couple of people involved. I mean, it was enough to get, apparently, the entire nations of the Philistines get their attention, because they have brought an army up to battle against Judah. And so we've come to arrest Samson. So, verse 11, then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock in Edom and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this you have done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. So, he took that as a personal attack, the fact that they killed his wife and his father-in-law, and so he killed them. And now these individuals of Judah, these people of Judah, says 3,000 men of Judah went down to Edom and said, Samson, what are you doing? You're picking a fight The Philistines have us kind of in a tribute type of situation. We really don't need any international trouble with them, and you're just picking fights left and right. And Samson's like, hey, they did this to me, so I did it to them. But they said to him, verse 12, we have come down to arrest you, that we may deliver you into the hand of the Philistines. So these men of Judah are like, listen, we do not want trouble. We don't want to go fight against the Philistines. Presumably they are stronger in number than they are. And so we're here to take you and deliver them to the Philistines. Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves. So they spoke to him, saying, no, but we will tie you securely and deliver you into their hand. But we will surely not kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Why is it important to note that they were 2 new ropes? Because he's strong. Yeah, these are 2 new ropes. They're not old. They're not frayed. Okay, they're not brittle. They're new ropes, so they should be full strength. When they came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. And then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. And when we see the Spirit of the Lord in context to Samson, what is it in reference to? His being strong. Strength. All right. So we see in verse 14, the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. And then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey I have slain 1,000 men. First of all, not only is he mighty in the sense of strength, but even didn't Solomon, kept wanting to say Samson. Didn't Solomon say that the battle is not always to the strong, the race is not always to the swift, time and chance happen to them all? Okay, no matter how strong you are, when you're facing at least 1,000 men, I'm convinced that there was a whole lot more than 1,000, because the men of Judah had 3,000 there. So I'm sure there was a whole lot more than just 1,000 men of the Philistines. But you have all of those men. Presumably some of them may have bows and arrows, but at the very least they've got swords or staffs or something. To be able to not be harmed through all of that is astounding. And again, we're not told that he was like Achilles or anything like that, where he was invulnerable, but there certainly had to have been some spatial awareness, some ability for Samson to move quickly, something more than just his great strength to prevent him from being randomly stabbed. When you've got 1,000, when you're surrounded by that many people, to kill that many and not be harmed, it's just obviously miraculous, right? No ordinary human could have survived something like that, but Samson did. And I'm hesitant to say that there was anything more than his great strength that was miraculous at work with Samson, but it does beg the question, was his great strength alone sufficient to keep him from being harmed? Maybe there was a little bit more to just his strength that God enabled him to do, or providence that kept the spears from hitting him just right, or whatever, that he was able to do this great thing. Anything through verse 15. We'll get to what he says here in verse 16 in a second. Anything through verse 15. Yes, sir.
Well, I think it's important to remember that Samson didn't have any business entering into a covenant with these people anyway.
Yep.
If that's what Exodus 23 said, that he was going to drive them out of the land, drive the Philistines out. But as far as the Spirit of the Lord coming upon them, that was evident that God was using Samson for his purpose, troubling the Philistines because of their overall wicked ways.
Right.
Of the Lord.
Right. To bring deliverance for Israel, because just as they acknowledged, we're kind of under tribute to them. They kind of rule over us. And so at this point in time, Israel wasn't the strength of a nation that they would be one day. Certainly under Saul and eventually David. So, yeah. We see the fact that in verse 16 he says, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey I've slain 1,000 men. And so it was when he had finished speaking that he threw the jawbone from his hand and called that place Ramoth-Lehi. And of course, Ramoth-Lehi is a reference to jawbone, which is kind of an interesting, it's like jawbone Lehi. But, and again, I'm not necessarily extrapolating from this anything wrong from Samson. But if you were Samson and you had just been delivered to be arrested, and you know what the Philistines are going to do to you, okay, they're likely to torture you and kill you if they don't just kill you immediately. So then you break these bonds, you kill 1,000 of them, presumably all the rest of them have run away. What would my and your first reaction perhaps be here? I would think that we would praise God. Thank you for delivering me from the hands of these Philistines. Thank you for giving me the strength to do all of this. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that what Samson says here is wrong because God isn't mentioned. I just think there's a pattern of behavior here where perhaps there's not as much thinking about Jehovah as maybe there should have been. Because what does he do? He sings a song about himself. Look at what I did. So then in verse 17 or verse 18, he became very thirsty. So now it's not he calls upon God now that he's sung his little song about what he's done. And oh yeah, God, thank you for giving me the strength. Now he's very thirsty. He just killed 1,000 men. I'm sure he's very thirsty. So he cried out to the Lord and said, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised? It's an interesting prayer to the Lord, an interesting statement to the Lord. What does he acknowledge? Okay, God did do this, didn't he? And Samson does acknowledge this. He says, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. So there is an understanding there from Samson that what I'm doing, I'm not doing of myself, that this is from you. Okay? And that should be noted. But it's interesting because as he goes on, now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised. And again, I don't want to be too... Because there are times where Moses says things that you're kind of like, I don't know that I would phrase it quite like that to the Lord. You know, times in the Old Testament where like Elijah might say something in prayer to the Lord. And that's kind of an odd statement to make. I don't know. Maybe it's something missing in translation there. So maybe that's the case here. But it just seems a little bit self-serving to a certain extent. But still, okay. So in verse 19, does God get mad at Samson? Do we see in reaction from God in terms of condemning Samson for a statement? Nope. God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he called its name in Hakore, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So he must have been not just parched, okay, he must have been really thirsty. And it was at a point where apparently his life was on the line, I guess you could say. He was about to die, it seems. And that's when, and of course this isn't Samson talking, it's being recorded for us that his spirit returned and he revived. But it's just an interesting dialogue from Samson to God. He acknowledges that God was the one that gave him that strength to do that. And I think that's, you know, that certainly would fit with what he was probably raised hearing. Remember, his parents were told that he will deliver his people and this is what he's, going to do. So Samson was probably raised knowing, at least to some extent, that God's going to do something with you. And Samson may have figured out by now, this is what God's going to do with me. He's going to bring judgment upon the Philistines. So maybe that kind of explains some of this. Nolan?
I'm just curious if you have any thoughts. Back in 1325, the first time this phrase was used, the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times.
Mm-hmm.
As I go through these different stories or events, I go back and forth whether it was Samson deciding, I'm going to take on these thousands of guys, or there's some feeling, some awareness, whatever inside of him that this is a time God wants me to do a mighty deed here.
Yeah.
And it's that wording real at the end of chapter 13 that makes me wonder if the Spirit began to move him at times
Yeah.
to do these various deeds.
Yeah, I don't know. The Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at Mahanadan. Yeah. I don't know if that's just his great strength, and maybe at times, maybe there were times he could feel that strength. Again, the way it's phrased, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and then he did. Did he always, was his strength there 24/7? Were there times maybe he felt it moving through him especially powerfully? I don't know. Maybe that was his cue to know, okay, we're about to rumble, there's something about to happen here. Maybe so. Maybe so. I obviously, my hesitation with that would be to preface it with saying, obviously, I don't believe that God is making him do and say everything that he does and says. I don't think Samson's a puppet. And some of the things that Samson does, I'm hesitant to say that they are good things, or says that they're good things, but God certainly is using his mindset, his view towards the Philistines, his reaction, his temper to...
As we stated, when Samson is in line with God's plan against the Philistines.
Yeah. Perhaps that's when it's especially obvious. Yeah, maybe so. Anything else through chapter 15? Okay, so final chapter, chapter 16. Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there, and he went into her. And when the Gazites were told, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. They were quiet all night, saying, in the morning, when it is daylight, we will kill him. And Samson lay low till midnight. Then he arose at midnight, took hold of the doors of the gate of the city, and the two gateposts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. That's like something you would see in one of our movies today that's graphically enhanced and computer generated and that sort of thing. I mean, that is not something that anyone has ever done for real, except for Samson. But I mean, you see some of these pictures of these great gateways into these cities. Remember, they had their walls that were high to defend these cities. He picked up the gate and the gate posts and put them on his shoulders and went up the hill. It's just unbelievable how strong he was. Now, before we end, here I want you to think about something before we end. God, generally, he uses individuals. We think about Gideon. We think about some of these other examples in the Old Testament where he uses individuals who may not have been the greatest and the strongest to bring about his will. Okay, David, for instance, was one of those. He was just a sheep farmer and so forth. Imagine how often Samson is depicted as this Arnold Schwarzenegger figure. He's got 9-pack, his muscles have muscles. What if Samson was scrawny? I just want you to picture that for a minute. What if Samson was scrawny? Because later on, Delilah's going to be put up to finding out what is the source of your strength. But if he were all buff and huge, they would know the source of his strength. He bench presses cows. But they had to ask, why are you so strong? And it just makes me wonder, what if Samson wasn't really all that big at all? What if he was a scrawny guy? Just picture this scrawny guy carrying these posts and this huge gate to the city up the hill to Hebron. It's just an interesting thought. All right, we'll stop there. We'll finish up with Samson next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody.